Thank you. Thank you for that amazing introduction, Professor Okeke-Ogulu. Thank you, Professor Eddie Glaude, for the invitation. Thank you, Ms. Dion Worthy, for facilitating this adventure, this experience here in Princeton. Thank you, Ms. Uchechi Kalu, for getting us set up today. When Professor Eddie Glaude graciously invited me to deliver the Center for African American Studies annual lecture, reflecting on the state of the discipline, not only was I deeply honored, but I figured I had reached a certain plateau in my career where I would be perceived as having had a long enough shelf life and sufficient scholarly expertise to speak authoritatively about historical matters. Although in full disclosure, I will not admit to having met Carter G. Woodson, Elaine Locke, or Zora Neale Hurston. No. I concede that my early years as a visual artist in Chicago and New York, my education at Morehouse College and Howard University in the 70s, and my graduate studies at Yale University in the 80s allowed me to meet a virtual who's who in African American arts and letters. And in conjunction with my subsequent work in this field, these experiences enabled me to witness firsthand and participate in the formations of this scholarly discipline. Coming into the field when I did, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and how I did, under the category of visual artists, significantly shaped how I thought about African American studies and how I still think about the field. I don't think I'm overly biased or exaggerating when I conclude that my involvement in African American studies as a student first and later as a scholar has coincided with the discipline's shift toward giving greater attention to African and African American art histories, to the material cultures of African peoples worldwide, and to visual matters within the African diaspora. Although there is a long history of humanists and social scientists utilizing visual data and or analyses in service to thinking about Black history and the contemporary conditions that Black people experience. And here I'm thinking about the range of previous scholarship from William Still's 1872 woodcuts and engravings in the Underground Railroad to Carter G. Woodson's profusely illustrated Associated Publishers Negro history books. It was arguably not until the late 1960s when artist-theorist Jeff Donaldson and Yale University art historian Robert Ferris Thompson independently placed art at the center of African and African American scholarship. Almost simultaneous with Donaldson's art theories and Thompson's Black Atlantic studies, art patron Dominique Dumesnil funded the first of several volumes entitled The Image of the Black in Western Art, profusely illustrated books that have reflected the latest scholarship on an African presence in world art. That Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African American Research have now republished the out-of-print volumes in this series. And as seen on the right, contemporary Black imagery, or rather commissioned new work on recent and contemporary Black imagery, speaks to the intrinsic place that art and visual culture have within African American studies. But instead of historically reviewing the discipline of African American studies this afternoon, I would like to make an interdisciplinary intervention, utilizing the knowledge and visual resources we currently have to revisit and rethink past scholarship in our field. It occurred to me to possibly undertake this African American Studies intervention while looking at the title page of an African American Studies classic, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois's 1903, The Souls of Black Folk, Essays and Sketches. As you might have suspected, I was immediately drawn to the word sketches in the subtitle of Du Bois's book, and I began to think, what if, in addition to being a sociologist, a philosopher, and an historian, Du Bois had been a visual artist or an art historian, and capable of sketching, painting, or visualizing the themes from the souls of black folk? What would those images have looked like? Or if he had placed those images alongside the text, what ideas or thoughts would have occurred from the combined forces of words and images? Now, before some of you start crying afoul and questioning the necessity, utility, or even the propriety of my interpolating a classic such as The Souls of Black Folk, please consider that rather than altering Du Bois's words, my aim is to illuminate this text, introducing artworks that might add another layer of meaning to an already rich and admittedly dense text. And one of my models for this visual interpolation is none other than your colleague, Professor Nell Irving Painter, friend and colleague and brilliant interlocutor, who pioneered the idea of mining the artistic motherlode for its interpretive treasures and revelations in her creating Black Americans. And let's face it, Du Bois's brilliant poetic book isn't the easiest book to read or critically unpack from a 21st century perspective. Not that providing images necessarily makes accessing the book easier, but thoughtfully placing pictures adjacent to the text and adding our own annotations to both pictures and words might bring some insights into Du Bois's ideas, or even better, complicate the text further, hopefully in a constructive manner. The Souls of Black Folk Illustrated will not be an historical recreation of Du Bois's visual world up to 1903. Rather, this version will be a back black to the future enterprise, employing images past and up to the present that, in my estimation, resonate with his thoughts and meditations at the dawn of the 20th century. For example, when I read Du Bois's oft-cited forethought in The Souls of Black Folk and think about his famous metaphor of the veil that both demarcates African American positionality and provides blacks with special insight, I'm struck by Du Bois's allusions to entombments and physical death, although reminiscent of sarcophagi and physical death. They are also vantage points that have the capacity to unlock Black signification and spirituality. When I read the introductory words, herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here at the dawning of the 20th century. And later on in that same paragraph, I have stepped within the veil, raising it that you may view faintly its deeper recesses, the meaning of its religion, the passion of its human sorrow, and the struggle of its greater souls. My mind's eye flashes back to Glenn Ligon in 1993, his powerful art installation, To Disembark. Upon entering Ligon's gallery installation, one encountered a room full of indescript shipping crates. And as one approached the crates, one could hear Black oratory and music emanating from each of them. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, Paul Robeson singing Deep River, Billie Holiday singing The Blues, and other Black voices. Although unapologetically alluding to Henry Box Brown and his crating and shipping of himself from Richmond to Philadelphia in 1849, Ligon, like Du Bois in his forethought, was also imagining these receptacles as symbolic sources of profound cultural understanding, hidden before our very eyes. The early 20th century sculptor Charles T. Keck also employed the metaphor of the veil in a sculptural homage to Booker T. Washington. But in this instance, the veil, rather than multivalent, was a symbol of ignorance and superstition. Almost immediately after the sculpture's dedication in 1922, critics of Washington, and no doubt champions of Du Bois, satirically described Washington's depicted lifting of the veil as instead pulling the wool over the eyes, so to speak, of African Americans. In a few minutes, I'll return to how one might visualize the W.E.B. Du Bois Booker T. Washington debate, but Chapter 1 in The Souls of Black Folk, entitled Of Our Spiritual Striving, is especially important to this interpolation by further exploring Du Bois's veil metaphor. Although the following passage is probably the best known from the book and the most frequently quoted, I'll repeat it anyway. After the Egyptian and Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton and Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, a world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Suggesting the veil was a symbol for the color line, Du Bois nevertheless paired its discriminatory function with its power to provide African Americans with second sight, thus characterizing its observatory-like capacity as both a blessing and a curse. There are innumerable examples of artworks that frequently utilizing mirror imagery as a kind of concretized veil entree into other worlds, probed Du Bois's theory of double consciousness, from Archibald Motley's Brown Girl After the Bath to John Robinson's eternally reflective self-portrait. But several key works by contemporary artist Carrie Mae Weems perhaps captured this notion of personal revelation via the eyes of others in an especially direct yet universalizing manner, starting with Weems's infamous Snow White spoof from her Trenchant Ain't Jokin' series, and culminating with her similarly themed Not Mayonnaise Type series. These representations of racial self-reflexivity with their socially and culturally entrenched assailants and detractors brilliantly visualized Du Bois's dialectically sundered Negro, but further cleaved by Weems via the added societal challenges of gender and sexuality. The Dawn of Freedom, Chapter 2 in W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, presented readers with a history of the Freedmen's Bureau, an 1860s organization that, in Du Bois's words, set going a set of free labor, established a beginning of peasant proprietorship, secured the recognition of black freedmen before courts of law, and founded the Free Common School in the South. Such an organization and events-specific history can't be illustrated without numerous pictures. But for a single image that encapsulated that auspicious liberatory moment and the promise of black equality, education, and economic independence, Fernando Miranda's wood engraving of black Philadelphians surrounding Francesco Pezzecar's statue of the freed slave at the 1876 Centennial Exposition is a strong candidate. Not only did Miranda successfully depict this controversial bronze statue in all of its theatricality and sensuality, but he sensitively captured the sentiments and reflections of a whole spectrum of black Americans on the subject of emancipation, from the elegantly dressed elites and the aspirants on the margins, to those who were clearly born after emancipation, to those who, because of their seniority and infirmities, had probably experienced slavery firsthand. An organization that ultimately was unsuccessful in lifting the former slaves into an equitable position vis-a-vis their former owners, the Freedmen's Bureau was described by Du Bois as a disappointment of major historical proportions. Its failure is the result of bad local agents, the inherent difficulties of the work, and national neglect. Thomas Nast, America's foremost editorial cartoonist at the time of the Freedmen's Bureau, presaged Du Bois's assessment of the organization in an 1868 cartoon for Harper's Weekly. Entitled, "This is a White Man's Government," Nast's cartoon brought together a symbolic triumvirate of the Democratic Party, a working-class Irish immigrant, a former Confederate soldier, and a Manhattan financier, to show the political and economic forces that were behind the squashing of African American rights and ambitions during the Reconstruction era. Chapters 3 through 6 of The Souls of Black Folk focused on education, with the first of these chapters of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others leveling an especially harsh critique of Washington's agenda of dissuading blacks from political activities and instead encouraging them to pursue an industrial education and business. Mr. Washington, wrote Du Bois, distinctly asks that black people give up, at least for the present, 3 things. First, political power. 2, insistence on civil rights. 3rd, higher education of Negro youth, and concentrate all their energies on industrial education and accumulation of wealth and the conciliation of the South. As a result of this tender of the palm branch, Du Bois continued, what has been the return? In these years, there have occurred 1, the disenfranchisement of the Negro, 2, the legal creation of a distinct status of civil inferiority for the Negro, 3, the steady withdrawal of aid from institutions for the higher training of the Negro. Du Bois then rhetorically asks, is it possible and probable that 9 millions of men can make effective progress in economic lines if they are deprived of political rights, made a servile caste, and allowed only the most meager chance for developing their exceptional men? In addition to Du Bois's emphatic no to that question, and likewise to Washington's policies, one could place alongside his retort a portrait of George Henry White, a North Carolina lawyer, Reconstruction-era state legislator, U.S. congressman, and living example of black political activism at the turn of the 19th century, at the close of the 19th century. In sharp contradistinction to Booker T. Washington's call for black acquiescence, George Henry White vehemently objected, even for policy's sake, to African Americans putting their hands upon their mouths and their mouths in the dust under the political oppression with which they are visited. Best known for his congressional speech of 1901 in defense of blacks having equal representation under the law, the Latin-speaking, Howard University-educated White was certainly in Du Bois's mind when, along with criticizing Washington in this chapter, he advocated a classical education for establishing African American leaders and educators. In chapter 4, entitled Of the Meaning of Progress, Du Bois expounded upon the Souls of Black Folks' double-edged program of moral castigation and social advocacy, but in a less confrontational fashion. In this chapter, he substituted argumentation and the retelling of histories with poetry and prose, painting with words scenes of everyday life from behind the veil that juxtapose impressionistic red clay paths with gritty, eroded landscapes, and populated by a black peasant demographic that's denied any and all sympathy from most of the population of the United States at that time. I have called my tiny community a world, Du Bois writes, and so its isolation made it. And yet there was among us but a half-awakened common consciousness, sprung from common joy and grief at burial, birth, or wedding, from a common hardship in poverty, poor land, and low wages, and above all, from the sight of the veil that hung between us and opportunity. An opportunity for this community encompassed a variety of situations and settings, from creating and developing one's business to attending to one's own basic literacy. Decades after The Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois's emphasis on black domesticity in the Of the Meaning of Progress chapter was pictorially realized in photographs like this one by the Columbia, South Carolina photographer Richard S. Roberts, perceptively capturing Columbia's black elites in the neighborhood known as Little Harlem. Roberts turned the American dream of a family, a house, and a domesticated pet into an African American fact, a reality that Du Bois could have only envisioned for very few African Americans in 1903. Chapter 5 of The Wings of Atalanta is pure Du Bois, socially censorious, defiantly anti-capitalist, and shrewdly shaped by his classical education. Atalanta and Hippomenes, an oil on canvas painting by the Italian Baroque painter Guido Reni, illustrates the Greek myth that Du Bois thematically appropriated for this chapter. Atalanta, the daughter of King Iossos, was a devotee of Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, and consequently had taken an oath of virginity. To satisfy her father's desire to marry, Atalanta agreed to do so only if her suitor could outrun her in a foot race. Those who lost would be executed. Hippomenes, a southern Greek youth who was in love with Atalanta, asked the goddess Aphrodite for help, and she gave him 3 golden apples. In the course of Hippomenes' race with Atalanta, he intermittently dropped each of the 3 golden apples, so that every time Atalanta was about to get ahead of him, she would instead bend down and grab one of those golden apples, and increasingly fall behind in the race. In this way, Hippomenes won the foot race and married Atalanta. In the black world, Du Bois writes, the preacher and teacher embodied once the ideals of this people, the strife for another and a juster world, the vague dream of righteousness, the mystery of knowing. But today, Du Bois quickly interjects, the danger is that these ideals, with their simple beauty and weird inspiration, will suddenly sink to a question of cash and a lust for gold. He continues, here stands this young black Atalanta, girding herself for the race that must be run. And if her eyes be still towards the hills and sky, as in the days of old, then we may look for noble running. But what if some ruthless or wily or even thoughtless Hippomenes lay golden apples before her? What if the Negro people be wooed from a strife for righteousness, from a love of knowing, to regard dollars as the be-all and end-all of life? Just a short distance from Du Bois's Atlanta University office was Atlanta's Decatur Street, where he would have had some familiarity in the scholarly sense with the seamier side of African American life, with its pool rooms, dance halls, houses of prostitution, and other dens of iniquity and temptation. Construing the mythological Atalanta with the city or the community of Black Atlanta, Du Bois vociferously criticized the question of cash and lust for gold with which Black Americans were increasingly grappling. An illustrated sheet music cover from the 1902 ragtime song, I'm from Missouri and you gotta show me, pictorially encapsulated Du Bois's sense of an encroaching materialism among African Americans at the turn of the century. An avarice which is satirically visualized by contemporary artist Hank Willis Thomas is a byproduct of our own 21st century preoccupation, to paraphrase Du Bois, with property and money. Thus, the resounding message of the Wings of Atalanta was a nobility of character and a sense of purpose in life that superseded the ethical lapses and moral frailties of the average man and woman. And Du Bois's recommended path to this higher plane of an African American consciousness was education. Although the next chapter in The Souls of Black Folk, of the training of Black men, firmly situated Negro education at the heart of Du Bois's polemic, the Of the Wings of Atalanta chapter introduced this prescription in the following preamble. The worker must work for the glory of his handiwork, not simply for pay. The thinker must think for truth, not for fame. And all this is gained only by human strife and longing by founding the common school on the university and the industrial school on the common school, and weaving thus a system, not a distortion, and bringing a birth and not an abortion. Du Bois's references here to an indefatigable pedagogical program, to the common school, and to a metaphorical parturition conjured images like that of Winslow Homer's taking a sunflower to the teacher. Indeed, images of black youth appear throughout the souls of black folk, not only as wide-eyed, inquisitive pupils, but as foils to the popular turn-of-the-century depictions of undisciplined black children who appeared in mass media photographic tableaus and cartoons throughout this period. Countering this racist onslaught of cultural propaganda, Du Bois initiated his own campaign to shift society's perceptions from a derogatory and jaundiced view of African Americans to a more enlightened and affirmative racial attitude for a new century. Chapter 6 of The Training of Black Men made this agenda crystal clear, emphatically stating that Negro colleges like Atlanta University and Tuskegee Institute must maintain the standards of popular education, seek the social regeneration of the Negro, and must help in the solution of problems of race contact and cooperation. And finally, Du Bois concluded, they must develop men. Although when Du Bois wrote this, he was still decades removed from the paintings of the renowned Harlem Renaissance artist Aaron Douglas, Douglas's figural silhouettes and their chromatic gradations perfectly illumined Du Bois's regenerative metaphor. Had Du Bois illustrated the souls of black folk in 1937, Douglas's solar and stellar superimpositions in paintings like Aspirations would have surely appeared alongside the following oft-quoted passage. And to themselves, in these days that try their souls, the chance to soar in the dim blue air above the smoke is to their finer spirit boon and guerdon for what they lose on earth by being black. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of the stars, I summoned Aristotle and Aurelius and what soul I will, and they come all graciously with no scorn nor condensation. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Chapters 7 through 10 of The Black Belt, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, of the Sons of Masters and Men, and of the Faith of Our Fathers, or of the Faith of the Fathers, respectively, were sociological studies of the black community in the Deep South, circa 1900. Du Bois detailed the effects that segregation and discrimination had on African Americans, arguing that much of the negative stereotypes of blacks as lazy, violent, simple-minded, apart from being patently false, were the sad but foreseeable products of racism, economic exploitation, and political oppression. When Du Bois uses designations like the Black Belt and then rhetorically asks his readers, have you ever seen a cotton field white with harvest, its golden fleece hovering above the black earth like a silvery cloud edged with dark green, its bold white signals waving like the foam of billows from Carolina to Texas across that black and human sea? We are bombarded with vivid colors that, in addition to bringing life to his southern landscape, transformed the land into a high-key phenomenon, more hallucination than a reality. We are also presented with a set of grainy, monochromatic photographs flashing before our eyes, pictures that, although just as informational as Du Bois's words, bring us within the claustrophobic intimacy of a Petersburg, Virginia cabin, or inside the ill-fitting hobnail boots of laborers returning at sunset from picking cotton on Alexander Knox's plantation on Mount Pleasant near Charleston, South Carolina. In 1992, the abstract sculptor Leonardo drew created an 8.5-foot high by 13-foot wide wall of cotton and wax that, perhaps not unconsciously, brought Du Bois's early 20th century vision of the South's #1 cash crop into startling proximity with contemporary art audiences. In chapter 10 of The Faith of the Fathers, Du Bois described the rise of the black church and examined the history and contemporary state of religion among African Americans circa 1900. But here his social scientific distance soon gave way to a highly personal first-hand account of the black church, one that revealed his own epiphany to both a brand new and a very old form of African American spirituality. It was out in the country, far from home, on a dark Sunday night. The road wandered from our rambling log houses up the stony bed of a creek past wheat and corn until we could hear dimly across the fields the rhythmic cadence of song, soft, thrilling, powerful, that swelled and died sorrowfully in our ears. A sort of suppressed terror hung in the air and seemed to seize us, a Pythian madness that lent terrible reality to song and word. The black and massive form of the preacher swayed and quivered as the words crowded to his lips and flew at us in singular eloquence. The people moaned and fluttered, and then the gaunt-cheeked brown woman beside me suddenly leapt straight into the air and shrieked like a lost soul, while round about came wail and groan and outcry and a scene of human passion such as I had never conceived before. In 1940, artist William Henry Johnson, decades removed from having attended an ecstatic country church like the one Du Bois described, nevertheless captured in paint the call and response of black congregants, their spiritual, out-of-body states of euphoria, and the beat accentuation and beat suspension of hand clapping and foot stomping, in the high contrast strip quilt aesthetic of I Baptize Thee. Although in a subsequent chapter, Du Bois will bemoan the encroaching heterodoxy of sanctified grassroots churches and their debased or blues-influenced gospel music, he recognized that the old-time religion of African Americans, along with its acquiescence to an unjust world and blind fatalism, was destined to rise out of the valley of the shadow of death and embrace a new religious ideal. In chapter 11 of The Passing of the Firstborn, Du Bois tells the story of his own infant son's death from diphtheria. But not even this family tragedy could escape Du Bois's polemic in the souls of black folk, turning Burghart's death into a moratorium on democracy's failings, especially in regards to black youth. In vain, Du Bois exclaimed, "For where, O God, beneath thy broad blue sky shall my dark baby rest in peace, where reverence dwells and goodness and a freedom that is free. All day and all that night there sat an awful gladness in my heart," Du Bois shamefully confessed. Not dead, but escaped. Not bond, but free. Somewhat like Margaret Garner, some 50 years earlier, who, as painted by Thomas Satterwhite Noble, chose infanticide for her child over slavery's walking death. Du Bois described Burghart's premature passing as a kind of flight or release from an oppressive world and a delimiting future. Well sped, my boy, before the world had dubbed your ambition insolence, had held your ideals unattainable, and taught you to cringe and bow. Better far this nameless void that stops my life than a sea of sorrow for you. The next two chapters of Alexander Crummell and of the coming of John will more or less continue in this same gendered vein as of the passing of the firstborn, describing the challenges of life under the veil as especially onerous for young black men. In his early 30s at the time The Souls of Black Folk was written, Du Bois, still grieving over the loss of Burghart, would not have been impervious to the particular sufferings of African American men and boys whose aspirations and strivings in life were routinely thwarted by institutional and societal racism. Recounting in chapter 12 the remarkable life story of the Episcopalian priest and Pan-Africanist Alexander Crummell, Du Bois held this black man out as exceptional and the fortuitous beneficiary of a time in history when, despite the horrors of slavery, a death-dealing war of tremendous proportions, and the political retrenchments of the post-Reconstruction era, he girded himself to walk down the world. Du Bois interpreted Crummell's historical moment in what, at least for me, has to be the most poetic passage in this book. The 19th was the first century of human sympathy, the age when half wonderingly we began to descry in others that transfigured spark of divinity which we call myself, when clodhoppers and peasants and tramps and thieves and millionaires and sometimes Negroes became throbbing souls whose warm pulsing life touched us so nearly that we half gasped with surprise, crying, "Thou too? Hast thou seen sorrow and the dull waters of hopelessness? Hast thou known life?" And then, all helplessly, we peered into those other worlds and wailed, "O world of worlds, how shall man make you one?" Du Bois is really talking here about empathy, that state of consciousness in which an emotional correspondence for someone or something is supplanted by an intellectual one, an equivalency that the conscious mind and the pre-rational brain assesses and responds to accordingly. This is arguably what the realist artist Thomas Eakins has achieved in his painting Negro Boy Dancing, placing himself in psychological accord and emotional parity with the three depicted African Americans. Alexander Crummell, Du Bois tells us, had been a precocious child who, also like the boy in Henry Ossawa Tanner's acclaimed painting The Banjo Lesson, absorbed the tutorials of wise elders and the tough lessons of a cruel, often unforgiving world. And also similar to Tanner's The Banjo Lesson, Du Bois painted Crummell in an impressionistic light that even behind racism's restrictive, discriminating veil, proclaimed his humanity and revealed his membership in the greater global community. And yet, as Du Bois explored in chapter 13 of The Coming of John, not even empathy could be counted on to bridge the gulf that an education potentially created between a young black man and the world. A fictional account of a boy from Georgia who goes off to college and upon return home is rejected by both the black community and the town's white patricians. Of The Coming of John presented a sober picture of black genius and initiative at the turn of the century. Albert Alexander Smith's cover design for the special education issue of The Crisis, of a young black farmer dreaming about a distinguished group of learned black men, including W.E.B. Du Bois, the editor of The Crisis, and fellow artist Henry Ossawa Tanner, suggested a comparable notion being espoused here of privileging education over manual and agricultural labor for the black masses. A none too subtle jab at the late Negro spokesperson Booker T. Washington, Smith's drawing, like Du Bois's essays in The Souls of Black Folk, promoted the idea of African Americans setting their professional sights far beyond the land and capital, and even if it sometimes meant alienating oneself from the soil and home, participating in higher intellectual exchanges and professional activities. Smith's daydreamer, as seen by his floppy necktie and artist smock, has already abandoned the more typical attire of the sharecropper, and with eyes cast upward, has already set his sights on a loftier, more cerebrally fertile plateau to cultivate. And yet, based on these last few chapters, if one were to cast Du Bois as an elitist snob, unreceptive and unfeeling towards the harsher realities and economic hardships that confronted the average black man and woman at the turn of the century, then chapter 14 of the Sorrow Songs would surely counter that stark assessment. Du Bois's essay-length tribute to Negro spirituals boldly set Negro folk music apart from America's other cultural offerings, noting that the Negro folk song stands today not simply as the sole American music, but as the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side the seas. The following audio-visual meditation on Du Bois's praise song to Negro folk music evocatively takes hold of Du Bois's notion of these songs being the music of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment, telling of death and suffering and unvoiced longing towards a truer world, of misty wanderings and hidden ways.
Sometimes I feel like a stranger in a strange land. Sometimes I feel a stranger's hand. Sometimes I feel like a stranger in a strange land. Long way. Long way from home, yes, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm on a road less traveled. Sometimes I feel like my life will come unraveled. Sometimes I feel I'm on a road less traveled. A long way from home. Ooh. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like I've spent my life just running wild. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. A long way from home. From home, a long way from home.
Was that the right one? Yes. I think that was the right one, yes. Over the inner thoughts of the slaves and their relations, Du Bois reminds us, the shadow of fear ever hung, so that we get all but glimpses here and there, and also with them eloquent omissions and silences. Like Romy Bearden's powerful mid-1960s collages that themselves are pictorial explorations into the minds and spirits of African American folk. Du Bois perceptively detected in Negro folk music the calculated silences and intervals between fact, theory, and feeling. Mother and child are sung, observes Du Bois, but seldom father. Fugitive and weary wanderer call for pity and affection, but there is little of wooing and wedding. The rocks and the mountains are well known, but home is unknown. Guided by the often enigmatic lyrics and narrative elisions of the Negro spirituals, Du Bois countenances here for the unspeakable horrors and psychological traumas that undergird the sorrow songs. But in spite of the Negro spirituals' commerce in black pain and suffering, it still remains, writes Du Bois, as the singular spiritual heritage of the nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people. And not surprisingly, Du Bois immediately followed of the sorrow songs and concluded the Souls of Black Folk with a prayer of sorts. Hear my cry, O God the reader. Vouchsafe that this book fall not stillborn into the world wilderness. Let there spring, gentle one, from out its leaves, vigor of thought and thoughtful deed to reap the harvest wonderful. Let the ears of a guilty people tingle with truth, and 70 millions sigh for the righteousness, he liked that word, which exalted nations in this drear day when human brotherhood is a mockery and a snare. Thus in thy good time may infinite reason turn the tangle straight, and these crooked marks on a fragile leaf be not indeed the end. Entitled The Afterthought, this brief but demonstrative petition, not to God per se, but to the higher moral element of the souls of black folks' readership, was Du Bois's parting salvo from this war with words and images. A missile wrapped in the trappings of a prayer that, apart from invoking the metaphors of an abundant harvest and a truth-seeking justice, requested enmity and the labyrinthine be replaced with clarity and righteousness. Having curated the exhibit of American Negroes at the Paris Exposition of 1900, Du Bois would have known something about images and would have been familiar with Francis Benjamin Johnston's photographs of the students, teachers, and activities at black colleges. One of Johnston's photographs, Arithmetic, Measuring and Pacing Hampton Institute, brought Du Bois's closing idea of infinite reason making the tangled straight to life, but in the mode of a meticulously staged tableau vivant. Posing in front of Hampton's Romanesque-styled Marcan Memorial Church, the female students and their teachers with yardsticks and measuring tapes put mathematical equations to task in a thoroughly modern, analytical manner. Pictures such as these not only illuminated the souls of black folk, but they argue for art and visual culture's capacity to lend significant meaning and interpretive possibilities to the study and critical exegesis of African American life and cultural production. Thank you. Yeah, questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer or try to answer. I know some of the images I went through really breathlessly, and in our little meditation I didn't have any captions, so if you want IDs, I can try to do that for you. I mean, I've had fun on iMovie, you can see, you know. I get my little images together and I listen to the music and I try to get those crescendos going. And you know, they have that thing called, they have that Ken Burns effect, which is basically, yes.
This is spectacular. I can't even imagine teaching souls this way in the classroom. It lends the whole idea of a social survey a whole new perspective.
Thank you.
It's spectacular. I wonder if you gestured a bit at the beginning about toward Du Bois's invocation of the rhetoric of strangeness, peculiarness. And then you talked a bit in so many of these scenes that you have for us are so representative, so mimetic, and so they're sort of born out of a kind of realism that I think marks so much of the visual culture that you're describing here. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit more formally about how some of that rhetoric of peculiarity and strangeness gets invoked in the visual. You talked a bit about Tanner's Impressionism as kind of a formal way of blurring some of these rigid divisions. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit more formally about how some of the non-representative aspects of the visual might invoke some of that Du Boisian rhetoric.
Okay. Thank you for making note of something that occurred to me as I was thinking about this talk, that he constantly is referencing weirdness, strangeness, ideas, inspirations that come from someplace and he doesn't even know where they come from. And I would agree with you that on initial looking at many of these works, the representational might seem to suggest something else. But I would also argue that if you look long enough and if you think more intently about even some of the most representational works, such as even Francis Benjamin Johnston's Arithmetic, Measuring, and Pacing Hampton Institute, that weirdness and that strangeness and that kind of queerness kind of filters through even these works that on the surface seem to be telling us a kind of a straight ahead story. Francis Benjamin Johnston, as many of you know who are art historians or know photo history, was from Washington, D.C., was a very important a photographer who initially did a lot of work on the presidents and major figures in D.C. And she got this kind of bee in her bonnet to kind of deal with pedagogy. And so she has a lot of pictures of elementary school groups and historically black colleges. And I see in these works this kind of surrealness that kind of goes way beyond the things that perhaps actually transpired at these schools. And I would say that even some of the other works that I've shown to you that are figurative or representational, again, if you have a chance to look at them a little bit longer, you begin to kind of understand that, as my dear friend Michael Eric Dyson says, you have the narrative, and then you got the meta-narrative. And that meta-narrative is what lies beneath, the kind of calm or the stoicism of the figure, or the story that seems to be played out, kind of by the artists. Did you have specific works in mind that you?
Well, I think of less of the photographic, right? The Walker, Douglas, where form can be less mimetic. I mean, certainly there's always sort of a strangeness that lives in sort of realistic, mimetic representations of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that lives on the surface exactly as you're
Yeah.
but some of the more as you're describing, the figurative modes,
Yeah.
where there's a more conscious invocation of that kind of mode of strangeness.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
but I mean, I take your point that it's, even in the photography.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, for example, in Thomas Satterwhite Noble's painting, Margaret Garner, and Nell is my witness. I mean, this is a loaded painting, because not only is he, kind of retelling the story, and it's actually, he's not even telling it correctly, because the child that dies is a little girl, and he's placed a little boy on the ground here. And one of the things that I talk about in my Cutting a Figure book are these hands, this white hand on one side and this black hand on the other. And while there's that gulf there, I mean, those open hands just have their own way of telling, a story about availability and power and seizure. That again, during this era, artists weren't willing to necessarily spell it out in as graphic and as unseemly a way. And so artists find ways, subtle ways, to kind of, present, the kind of the underbelly and the real horror and trauma of kind of a moment, Yes.
Tomorrow we will be hosting 23 high school students from across the nation who have been improving race relations in their schools and communities. And after the recent Supreme Court case, what image could I suggest to them that might encourage them to think that this is not a white man's government?
Well, that's a tough question, because what you're asking me to come up with is an image that might propagandize in another direction than many people might think is the case. and well, you know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking of Gordon Parks's American Gothic. A photograph from 1942 that shows a woman, a domestic woman, working, cleaning lady in a government building, and her broom is on one hand and her mop is on the other hand. The American flag is behind her.
And I was thinking also perhaps of a Gilbert Young Sr. one. There's one somewhere out there where there is the flag being sort of pulled through a hand. And I was thinking that.
See, I like mine better, because, in the sense, only because it's like Gordon Parks is not trying to erase the flag or mar the flag. He's just saying, here's the flag, and here is this woman and her reality. Y'all go figure.
Thank you.
Yes,
So, thank you so much.
thank you.
For this. I have a new way of teaching souls now. How might the visual speak back to souls critically and not amplify the arguments? Right. So, aspects of 1903 Du Bois, right? That. So, how might the image of Josie, gender, show up in this text, right? What do we do with, I mean, the passage you read from of the passing of the firstborn, the next two words after that passage actually is idle words. He takes it back. Right?
Yeah, I love it when people throw stuff out and say, "Oh, but I take it back."
Yeah,
but you put it out there.
So what I'm interested in is
Yeah.
how might a kind of visual critical response to souls, what might that look like? Right. I'm not saying pull it up, but what I was noticing is that there was a kind of amplification of argument,
Yeah, yeah.
a kind of rendering of the text visually.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens to the critical engagement with the text?
Yeah, yeah. I'm kind of at a loss because while on one hand I think that what I was attempting to do was to find a way to kind of enter the text via images, I don't know if I would have necessarily described what I pulled together as uncritical. But I hear what you're saying, that there are aspects of the text, and one can think about how one might use images to kind of find another way through it, to kind of have us operate or experience it from another kind of place. You know, and this is off the cuff, but one of the things that I'm a big lover of are portraits. And I dropped in very few pictures of Du Bois in this presentation. I think I had that one as a very young man at the beginning, and then I've got that one by Vinold Rice at the end. Right. But one way to kind of think about a way of kind of putting the text or operating not against the text, but really forcing us to kind of think about these words and what they mean or what they meant or how one might take them apart, might be to look at him as a figure. And I guess the image that's kind of coming to me as you were talking is at the exposition in Paris, where he has his top hat on and he's got his hands in his pocket. Right. And, you know, he's really kind of jauntily, you know, kind of, you know, profiling as we will do. And that might be, you know, an image to kind of think about from kind of his perch as he kind of begins this exploration of the world, you know, behind the veil. You know, another way of working against the text might be to look at Tuskegee, to think about all of the amazing things that did happen there, and to really kind of marvel at the achievement of Washington at a time when it was very, very difficult for black people. And for somebody from his background, of his experience, to kind of lift himself up or to be lifted in the various and extraordinary ways that he is. Maybe that might be the way to kind of find an interesting counterpoint, or at least a visual conversation, you know, with and against the souls.
What I was thinking about, just really quickly, is just the idea of blackness that runs through souls, right? And then for me, the eruption of the Walker silhouette showed up,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what she's doing with slavery in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
right? And how visually, right, the way in which blackness has been and is, you know, engaged, right? How might we trouble the conception of racial representation that's in the text?
Yeah, Carol Walker is a troublemaker, but I have to say I really feel like she often gets a bad rap. I think that her troublemaking is really useful, in that she really forces us to come to terms with the unmentionable, with the unspeakable. And therein, she provides a nice, she's great with the spirituals, because what we don't hear is what we see. Yeah. But that's really food for thought, Eddie. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powell. This is such an innovative intervention that you're making. I have a question about, I kind of want to go back to Christopher's point about representation, and I'm thinking about I have two questions. How might the availability of the black figure or the figure in and of itself be indicated in a project like Souls Illustrated? And also, how might we recuperate abstraction into speaking to the kind of strangeness of the dimensions, some of the dimensions within Souls of Black Folk, but also thinking about maybe the veil as an abstraction, so to speak. So.
Yes. I mean, no, I think that I think we have a virtual museum to pull from. And again, when I thought about the Golden Fleece, and I remember standing in front of Leonardo Drew's wall, I mean, for me, it brought me back to Souls. It also made me think deeply about, this commodity, this thing. And thank God for conceptual artists like that who kind of take the raw materials of life. David Hammonds is one of those participants in that. There are any number of artists who kind of use objects and things and recontextualize things. And Souls not only is a record of a people, it very much has interesting moments that do kind of park on place and labor. And so I mean, I think it's really, it's unlimited what one could potentially do. In terms of again, the figure and how the figure both promises, on one hand, a kind of a blessed assurance of humanity, and at the same time presents a nightmare. Again, I think that artists have really, and photographers have really provided us with again, a virtual museum to choose from, particularly if one doesn't limit oneself to quote unquote fine art. I mean, we have the kind of world of documentary photography. We've got the world of and not just photography. I'm thinking about advertisements, which is why I threw in the ragtime poster, which is actually the moment that Du Bois is working in. And I swear I can't help but think that he's seeing, when he, goes into department stores in Atlanta or goes into, various establishments, these images, these Currier and Ives horror pictures, of Black people. So I just think that well, I mean, I'm biased. I'm an art historian, so I really feel like pictures, are not just illustrational. They are information themselves, and therefore they really lend themselves to use and to their own kind of independent way of kind of making sense of them.
Can we thank Dr. Powell?
Thank you.